Good morning. Welcome to Books at the Bottom of the Stairs. My name's Lorene, and this is my husband, Steve.
Hello.
There's nothing wrong with his glasses. They're meant to be that way. So we're talking to you about James by Percival Everett. It took forever to come in soft cover. I just wasn't sure that I wanted another hardcover in my life, and so we had to wait quite a while for James to come in. All the hype is pretty much done. I think James has drifted off to the background. Did it win? Yes, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and I'm not sure that was a good choice. Ooh. So Steve has some notes. I'm going off the cuff. We did not talk to each other about this book very much. We kept it to some pretty simple comments. And I read it first. And I guess you read it about a month or two later.
Yep.
And
Just finished.
I went to the trouble of reading Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn before reading James. But I did that about a year and a half ago because it just took so long for this book to come in. I thought they'd be like close together, but no, I was wrong. So I read Huckleberry Finn, and it is one of my favorite stories. I really enjoyed it. It was good. That's probably the fourth time I've read Huckleberry Finn, and it remains a really strong book in my, recommendations and books I'd want to have to reread. Have you read Huckleberry Finn before?
Yes, Huckleberry Finn is one of my favorite books as a child. I've probably read it half a dozen times, although I didn't reread it before reading James. And I guess the relevance of that is that James is a retelling of the Huckleberry Finn story from the perspective of the escaped slave, who in Huckleberry Finn is known as Jim.
And in this book, he's known as James, except by those who enslave him. In this story, James has a family, or it's more clear that he has a family, and that consists of a wife and one daughter. And they are owned by a different owner, I believe. The judge?
Yeah.
I think the judge owns his family. And he is owned by the widow?
Yeah.
I think. That comes into play at the end of the story. There might be spoilers here, and the book's been out for a long time, so if you don't want spoilers, well, good luck.
Okay.
So I was thinking that my expectation was that I would see James on the boat or the raft or the canoe or the island at the same time as Huckleberry Finn, and we would be seeing the same events through Jim's eyes as opposed to Huckleberry's. I would say that was true. That in terms of the chronology, that is pretty much what happened. Mm-hmm. What I didn't get, that we get from Mark Twain, is I did not get a sense of the river, and I didn't really get a sense of James the enslaved. James the enslaved has had the opportunity to read books from the judge's library, and so he's read philosophers. I can't remember exactly how he gets educated, but he does manage to get educated. Mm-hmm. And so that allows him to read books that, boy, would he ever get into trouble if he was caught. And so he's reading some sort of Enlightenment philosophers on the topic of freedom and self-expression and being... there's a word for it when you're inherently your own individual. You've got
right.
self-realization maybe. And so he has got ideas that are extremely sophisticated. I think one of the parts that I struggled with is I didn't want to see someone else's thoughts about these topics. I wanted to see Jim's and how he would express them as a man with a limited education. So that was a disappointment for me. And I also didn't feel that this journey down the river with Huck was well presented. I thought it hit all the expected landmarks, but beyond that, I didn't really get a sense of his traumas or fears. I didn't get an emotional response from James much. And then we come to the part 2 where Huckleberry and James are separated through, I think it's kind of a convoluted little moment in the story, and they get separated. James is on his own, and he's decided that he's going to go back and get his wife and child. And we see him encounter another person who is colored, who is passing as white. And I think it's at that point that we really start to see James. And however, he's gone from this very passive, observing, unengaged individual to really angry individual. And can understand how he arrives there, but I'm just not sure why it only came about in book 2. So those were my caveats for the book. In terms of the parts that I really enjoyed, I like a good Mississippi rafting adventure. That was fun. And I thought that Jim's point of view of Huck was interesting in that he sees Huck really as a child, and when Huck says certain things, when we get them in Mark Twain's version of things, we see him as sort of a precocious, whereas in this book we see him in a more childlike, kind of innocence, unawareness, naive point of view. And so that was a little bit different. I think I kind of liked seeing Huck as a not quite the suavo kid he thinks he is. It's 12 o'clock.
Right.
One more. There we go. Your turn.
Okay. Yeah, the bird is getting tired. So I think I'll start with one or two of the things that Lorraine's talked about. The first one is the kind of overall sense, and I feel that the overall sense of James's emotional state in the book is pretty clear. He's really driven by a conflict between extreme loyalty to, first of all, his family, second of all, to his fellow slaves in the community where he has been sold from before he flees, and third of all, a kind of puzzling interpersonal loyalty to Huckleberry. So those are really strong. But as far as everyone else in the world is concerned, you do get a feeling of overwhelming distrust, that nothing can be trusted, that there's no difference between a good owner and a bad owner, because a good owner is just as likely to sell you away from your family as a bad owner. Mm-hmm. So the distrust really came across pretty palpably. So that emotional landscape is pretty well described. But I would say that the physical landscape and the landscape of characters was very flat. I felt that the other characters in the book, some of whom we meet in Huckleberry Finn, and you can sort of borrow over what you remember from Huck Finn of the King and the Duke, for example, because they're not really portrayed as extravagantly as they are in Huckleberry Finn. Or in the case of characters that aren't in the Huckleberry Finn book, they just feel a little kind of one-dimensional. Yeah, and whether they're good characters or evil characters or ambivalent characters, they're just not very richly described. Similarly, there's a couple scenes where they encounter the steamboats, or where they actually are on the steamboat that eventually blows up. And those felt strangely disembodied experiences. And the steamboat itself just didn't add up in terms of how it was described. It was like a set, not a set with a boiler that happened to be on a steamboat, not the engine room of a steamboat. It was kind of that was the moment where for me the suspension of disbelief fell apart, is when they encounter the stoker on the steamboat. And then the third thing, which Lorraine has already talked about, is the river. And the river is such a living presence. It's like a character in Huckleberry Finn, but it is only a setting in James. Mm-hmm. And that was pretty disappointing, because I felt that the river would have all the things for James that it had for Huck in Huckleberry Finn, but it would also have another dimension of being, in many places, the tangible symbol of the line between slave states and non-slave states, but also the cruel kind of irony that that difference really wasn't meaningful in the life of a slave. Whether you were in Illinois or Kentucky ultimately didn't make any difference to your sense or your state of freedom or your state of safety if you were a slave. So those were the kind of that sort of overall sense. I think that Lorraine's talked a little bit about the books, and the books for me link to one of the big overall concepts of the novel, which is the idea that the slaves had a language that they used amongst themselves, which was standard English, and that they had a language that they used with the slave owners and other whites, or with slaves that they didn't know, so they didn't know whether they could trust them, as were they fully co-opted into the system or were they resistant. And that the slave language is in this book presented as a put-on thing that has to be taught to children, that it's not the natural way that they would speak, that they would normally speak. If they listened to the people around them in their childhood, they'd speak in a standard English. I felt that was a really strong overall concept, but I also felt like it was explained way too soon. It would have been, like, in a way, the reader doesn't get to encounter the strangeness of Jim slipping in and out of slave language the way that Huck does, or some of the other characters do, when he slips up and uses proper language in a context where he should be using a slave language. So we're let in on that secret, and it takes a lot of the power of it away, which I felt was kind of disappointing. And with that, it does, the question of how James comes to be reading Locke and Mill and other philosophers isn't really addressed, except that he physically, like, he gets at the books by sneaking into the judge's study, but how he comes to be in a place to do that isn't clear, although it does seem there's an implied informal, or an implied self-education system amongst the slaves that would account for that. So those are some thoughts relative to what you've already said.
Yeah.
Did you have more on that? I can look at my notes.
Steve's taking notes. He's a professor.
Yeah, retired now.
Yeah, I didn't take notes because I'm a failed student. No,
Yeah.
I'm not. But I think for me there was sort of a general sense of disappointment as I read the book. Because it was a Pulitzer Prize winner. I mean, it wasn't at the time, but I just made an assumption that this author was as skillful a writer to take on Mark Twain and retell it. I thought he's got to have pretty good credentials in terms of his writing skills, and also have some kind of a sympathy with Mark Twain's method. Maybe that's the word. Partly because Mark Twain is such an incredible way of dialogue, and he can convey in very short sentences an awful lot. But Mark Twain is also really well known for his descriptive prowess, and so I expected that from Percival Everett. I didn't feel that I got that, not just in the things we've already mentioned, but just as sort of an overall atmosphere to the story. I only felt anxious once, I think. Everybody was in the water after the steamboat exploded. And I mean, if I was to talk about that steamboat, I'd have to do a lot of spoilers. That whole section for me was just completely implausible. From the landing on it to the explosion, I felt it just didn't make any logical, factual sense. But the only tension I had was because I thought this isn't well written.
Right. Can I ask about that?
Yeah.
So I only reread the first couple chapters of Huckleberry Finn after I finished James, just to kind of look at that first encounter and the way it's redescribed, because the opening scene is the same in both books. But it seems to me they did end up on an exploding steamboat in the book.
Yes.
Unlike there's a couple of other places where there's inventions in the plot that are not there.
Yeah.
I think that in terms of those descriptive things, it would be going too far to say that this is fan fiction, but it's got some of the elements of fan fiction in that a bunch of things that feel like they should have been described or discussed or set up just aren't, because they're so well set up in Huck Finn.
Yeah.
But I think that hurts, that's also not addressed, or that mode continues in some of the scenes and characters who aren't in Huck Finn. So they're described at the same level as the things that are in Huck Finn. There's not a extra richness to how things are presented when we are outside the frame of Huck Finn.
Yeah. And one of the things that will forever be an unknown to me is whether the people who were thinking about the Pulitzer Prize had read Huck Finn, whether they actually had that with them as a means of discernment. Because if you haven't read Mark Twain's version, I think you'd find this a very flat book. Because as I'm reading, I'm thinking back and forth. And in fact, Mark Twain's book is more what enriches this book than it enriching itself. So that was one of my, just didn't get it.
Yeah.
What did you think of the second half of the book?
So the second half, so the second half...
He's on his own and he's going home.
Yeah. So the second half actually includes a major intervention in the Twain story, but it's forecast by the start of the Percival Everett book. So at the start of the Percival Everett book, he presents several pages of lyrics from Daniel Decatur Emmett's transcriptions of slave songs that were the basis of the blackface minstrelsy show that Emmett put on with the Virginia Minstrels. And nothing happens with those songs for the first part of the book. But nor do we see in the descriptions of slave life before James flees any presence of song in the slave setting in Hannibal, Missouri. So there's no sound of work songs. There's no people sitting at night singing different kinds of songs. But we've been given this big pack of 3 or 4 songs that are very well-known minstrel songs at the start of the book. In part 2, he comes into encounter with, and is actually sold to Daniel Decatur Emmett, although Emmett says he's just paying his temporary owner to free him so that he can join the minstrels because they've lost their tenor, and James has a tenor voice. I guess because he's singing in the scene with the blacksmith, but we've got no sense before that James could sing at all. This just kind of comes down out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So then he spends a fairly, like in the book, quite brief interval working with Emmett and the minstrels, and then there's a bad encounter and flees. Along the way he meets, in order to be a blackface minstrel, he's got to be black-faced on whiteface over his relatively light-skinned blackface in order that it be acceptable to white audiences. Yeah. And early in minstrelsy, for sure, an actual black musician in a minstrel group would have been a scandal. And there's always a tension in those minstrel scenes about who's black in the group or are they all white. Much later in minstrelsy, there are black musicians who blackface in order to be minstrels, and especially in England, they're quite successful. So I know a little bit about minstrelsy. There's a lot of scholarship about minstrelsy. And it's an interesting intervention to bring minstrelsy explicitly into the book, because there's lots of scholars who have read Huckleberry Finn, Twain's version, as a minstrel show. It follows most of the structures and tropes of a minstrel show. The kind of exaggerated language, the exaggerated interactions are like what's in a minstrel show, but there's actually no minstrel show in Huck Finn. We have a minstrel troupe and minstrel shows happening in James. So that's kind of interesting, but there's also been a lot of scholarship about minstrelsy that looks at the black origins of minstrelsy and doesn't just start from when Emmett wrote down the songs. And we don't really have any context for that. So really the minstrelsy that's in James is entirely the white blackface minstrelsy after it's been written down by Dan Emmett. There's a big device because we've already seen the contents of Dan Emmett's notebook at the start of the book. When James flees Emmett's troupe, he steals Dan Emmett's notebook with all those lyrics in it. And he's got a pencil that he got from someone else at great cost. So I had this thought that, well, there's that, and there's this kind of two languages thing. And there's clearly an extraordinarily exaggerated version of the put-on slave language that's used in writing Dan Emmett's lyrics. So I was waiting for Jim to start rewriting the songs, which never happens. He's using the blank pages in Dan Emmett's book to write his life story, which is implied to be the book we're reading, but there's no crossovers between that. So that to me was a little bit kind of like a kind of plot potential that was left hanging, because although we get the lyrics at the beginning and we get the lyrics again exactly as we got them in the beginning in the middle during the minstrel show, they're not there at the end.
I didn't know any of that.
So that
So look, we all got educated.
Okay. So it seemed like that would connect so strongly to this idea of the two languages. And late in the book, we get this scene where James reconfronts Judge Thatcher. And there's a powerful moment where what seems to be most threatening to the judge is not the pistol that James is holding, but the fact that he's speaking to him in plain standard English. That the judge's whole worldview has just been undone by the fact that his belief in an ignorant, non-literate black slave, a kind of subhuman, is actually being undone by the fact that this man is standing in front of him, speaking to him in his own language as an equal.
As an equal, yeah.
And I thought that the songs could have done that if he'd confronted the songs in some way. So being a kind of I had high hopes.
I also, as I say, initially with James's rage at the tail end of the book, I have no qualms with him being that upset and angry and frustrated. He had a very frustrating journey on the river in his own encounters with others. He wasn't frustrated with Huck so much. I think he was a little. He was a little bit frustrated with Huck, but it was not nearly to the degree of his frustration that he was probably having with the other people that he encountered. But I didn't get a real sense of that. I got more of a sense of he was observing it. But then once he's left Huck and he's on his own, makes a decision to go and basically escape his family.
Yeah,
rescue and escape with his family. His anger levels just rise to the point where he's willing to commit any kind of act in order to achieve his goals. And so where has this highly intelligent, observationally inclined person gone to? And also, that makes him a bit reckless, and it's the recklessness that gets him into a patch of trouble. And what else? I guess his recklessness kind of is what gets him onto the steamboat in a way, and which allows for. No, wait a minute, I'm getting confused. But anyhow, he encounters the judge, and he encounters his wife and child having been sold while he's gone. And so, I mean, yeah, for sure that would trigger anger, but and frustration and helplessness. But I guess as we get to the ending, and I don't want to make any spoilers there, it's sort of wrapped up in a way that becomes essential for the reader, but not essential for the story, if that makes sense. I think that given what transpired while he was gone, can almost imagine it being some sort of tragedy in a way, where he's not able to overcome the hurdles that he's presented at the end. To me, that would have been a bit more of a norm in terms of what enslaved people would have experienced at that time, that you get where you're going, your family's gone, and now what? And to be able to solve that and rescue them is almost less satisfying than trying to figure out how you're going to go forward in your life having missed that opportunity, like the regret of having left and not escaped with them initially, as opposed to, going back and saving them. It's a bit of a hero story at the end as opposed to a tragedy, I guess.
Yeah, the ending for me is kind of a hero in Armageddon kind of ending. That's, but that in particular in relationship to his wife and daughter. But then there's also a big revelation in relating to Huck that is a bit sappy in my mind.
Yeah, totally.
And so we've got both
yeah.
this kind of sentimental ending and everything goes boom.
Yeah.
And I do feel that in a way in the context of real life, perhaps that descent into anger, rage, and frustration is totally understandable. But this is a book that's been written in response to a different book that has a kind of epic structure. And so from a literary point of view, it's a really unsatisfying ending. Probably is a good ending for the movie.
I think this would have been a more interesting book if we had just had James. If we didn't really have him telling Huck's story. If we'd had him telling his own story where Huck makes a decision, he kind of, in Twain's, it's more like Huck's giving the instructions, and this one they're a bit more equal. But if it had been James kind of taking advantage of Huck as opposed to protecting him.
And there was an interesting aspect to it in that part of the role of the slave language was a way to communicate to the white owners and overseers what they ought to do without ever being seen to tell them what to do. And there's a pretty amusing bit of discussion about how to do that.
Yeah.
And actually he does school Huck even in that at a certain point, because a kid can't tell adults what to do. But it's true that the kind of ultimate goal of the Huck story arc meant that James couldn't be seen as just exploiting Huck as a device. But in some ways that could have been more interesting and satisfying.
Yeah.
So that and ultimately whatever his final relationship with Huck was, if he helps him to be safe or doesn't, it would come out of a different place than what we ultimately discovered.
Yeah. I think also Mark Twain more or less had it as Huck's personal development and coming to terms with enslavement and his culpability in it and so forth. Whereas I don't think at any point in either book it's a surprise for James to have feelings about not being free. It's so James's articulation around freedom and so on is at core already present by the time he's a young kid and understands his situation. I'm sure at that point he had an opinion, and so I felt it was kind of a shame that we had to use white philosophers to give him expression.
Yeah,
that I felt that was undermining and taking away from James as a man.
Right.
And I think it would have been in some ways more interesting to have seen him become eloquent on it. Like, what is it? There's that movie Elephant Man or something. I am not an animal, I am a man. Yeah. And, what is that? 6 or 7 words that are extremely powerful. And in the initial part of James's, as we read James, we think he doesn't have any more than about 6 or 7 words. But he could easily have been eloquent given his hidden standard English. But you know what? He could have been completely eloquent in his own enslaved language too. That would have been an interesting experiment.
It's possible, but that's, I guess, not this book.
No.
I think in light of what you're saying, there's a curious piece where along the way he steals some books. James steals some books. And one of the books is the narrative of an escaped slave. And he's extremely dismissive of that book and doesn't really give it any regard. Like after the first page or so, it seems like he's not going to read it. And so he starts with having dialogues with white European and British philosophers. He encounters a slave narrative, dismisses it, and then late in the book, one of the last kind of imaginary encounters he has is with one of those old white philosophers, just again James is again rejecting the alibi that this philosopher is providing for slavery. But I think you're right that it could have been more interesting to find some way that it's either coming from him or coming from reading between the lines of that slave narrative, which that the dialogue with the escaped slave might have provided a sense of how to express who he is and what his condition is, that isn't just oppositional to the imposed white slave-holding, slave-alibying view. But ultimately we end up back at an oppositional rather than a propositional kind of idea about who James is.
And also, just to make it clear, James is having these encounters with these white philosophers, and are they called rhetorical things, through his dreams. So, like, he isn't actually bumping into these individuals.
Right.
He's the device of the dreamscape or the nightmare or being unconscious while half drowned or something are the devices that allow for this kinds of conversation. And I guess that's okay, but still, fundamentally, I would have preferred not to have seen those philosophers at all in the book. I kind of makes me feel like his story needed to be validated by using these white guys to allow him expression. So I would say that overall, I did not enjoy this book as much as I wanted to.
No, I think that it's fair to say that we were both disappointed by it in similar ways and in some different ways in detail. I also think that a lot of the discussion we've just had is kind of not about what the book is, but about what the book might have been. Which actually we've kind of, in a weird way, you could critique our critique in the same terms that we critique the book in. It's like we did this thing, and but I would say that in the end, I would still, if the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is meaningful, then this book is worth reading. It is not without its challenges, but a lot of the puzzles and even the disappointments actually still link back to the original narrative. And as I was, even just a couple chapters I reread, I could see Huckleberry Finn slightly differently. So in some ways, I don't think it's a book that stands without Huckleberry Finn.
Yeah.
But I think it's got some disappointments and some problems, and a few moments of strong interest, but not that many. It's a little bit like a discussion about Huckleberry Finn more than a book about James.
Yeah, that was my takeaway too. So, so I think I said earlier that if you hadn't read Huckleberry Finn, I would find this a very flat experience. And also, if you were hoping to read this book so that you didn't have to read Huckleberry Finn, you'd get the plot line, but you could get that from Cole's notes too. So
maybe watch the Disney movie.
Watch the Disney movie.
It's got its own problems.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think, is that it for you?
I think so.
I think that's it for both of us. I hope you enjoyed this. It's we don't get to do this sort of thing too often because we quite often don't read the same books, or if we do read the same books, I've already reviewed it and Steve's late to the game because it takes him a year or two to get to where it's on his top of his pile. So, are all your reading dreams and adventures coming true these days?
Slowly. Reading is hard these days.
As per the glasses. So I hope all your reading dreams and adventures to continue to come true, and we will see you, or I will see you for sure next week. I don't know about Steve.
Well, I'll hear you telling them all about it next week, I'm sure.
I'm kind of noisy. All right, bye-bye for now.